3 houses. That's all the notice they gave me before demolishing my late wife's $2 million dream home. Priscilla Whitmore clicked across my gravel in designer heels, fake sympathy plastered on her face as she handed me $195,000 in bogus emergency structural violations. "Mr. Morrison," she said, with that voice that made my skin crawl, "I really am sorry it came to this, but safety is our top priority. And if I appeal, unfortunately, emergency safety protocols don't allow for delays." Her fake smile never wavered. "I know this is difficult, but we have to protect the community." She assumes this grieving old man will just surrender without a fight. She has no idea she just picked the wrong target. I'm Calvin Morrison, 63, retired government consultant to everyone here. What Priscilla doesn't know is about to destroy her entire world. Ever dealt with Cha-Cha Mustafa abuse? Drop your stories below, because Priscilla is about to learn the most expensive lesson of her life. Gradius, let me back up and tell you how this whole mess started. My wife Sarah and I bought this mountain property 3 years ago through a blind trust. See, when you're the sitting governor, privacy isn't just nice to have, it's essential, especially when your wife is fighting stage 4 cancer and you need a place where she can find peace away from the political circus. Sarah fell in love with this land the moment we saw it. 47 acres of pristine mountain wilderness with a custom log mansion she helped design herself. She spent months planning every detail, from the massive stone fireplace to the wraparound porch that faces the sunrise. But her favorite part was the wildflower meadow she planted behind the house. For the butterflies, she'd say, sitting in her wheelchair as monarch butterflies danced around us. The cancer took her 6 months ago. Heart surgery took a chunk out of me 4 months later. My daughter Emma's deployed overseas with the Air Force, so it's just me now, rattling around in this big house with nothing but memories and Sarah's wind chimes singing in the mountain breeze. That's when Priscilla Whitmore entered my life like a perfectly manicured tornado.
"Okay, sweetheart," I whispered to the butterflies drifting through her meadow. "Looks like we've got a fight on our hands." What I didn't know yet was that Priscilla had been counting on me to roll over and pay the fine like a good little retiree. She had no idea the confused widower she was trying to intimidate had spent 20 years in state politics, learning exactly how to deal with bullies who hide behind fake authority. Her first big mistake was underestimating her target. Her second was putting everything in writing. 3 weeks later, Priscilla showed up with a structural engineer, or at least someone wearing a hard hat who she claimed was a structural engineer. I was replacing one of Sarah's hummingbird feeders when I spotted them circling my foundation. The so-called engineer pointed at random spots on the stonework, while Priscilla scribbled notes. The smell of fresh mountain rain lingered in the air, and I could hear wet gravel crunch beneath their feet as they moved like vultures around my home. An hour later, Priscilla knocked on my door holding another thick envelope. "Mr. Morrison, I'm afraid we've discovered some serious safety concerns." She handed me a violation notice that made the earlier ones look like parking tickets. $125,000 in structural safety violations, claiming my foundation posed an imminent threat to neighboring properties. "According to our certified structural analysis," she read from her clipboard, "your foundation shows signs of critical settlement that could cause catastrophic failure. For the safety of the entire community, these violations must be addressed immediately." I studied the report. It was about as professional as a grocery list. No photos, no measurements, no specific locations, just vague language about concerning structural irregularities and community-wide safety risks. "I'd like to get a second opinion," I said. Priscilla's smile tightened. "Of course, but please understand, Mr. Morrison, emergency safety violations require immediate response. Cha-Cha Mustafa protocols don't allow for lengthy appeal processes when lives may be at risk." After she left, I did what any reasonable homeowner would do. I called a real structural engineer. Tom Bradley from Mountain Engineering Services arrived the next day and spent 4 hours examining every inch of my foundation with equipment Priscilla's fake engineer never even carried. "Mark," Tom said, showing me his readings, This is some of the most solid foundation work I've seen in 30 years. Premium concrete, perfect drainage, not a crack anywhere. Whoever told you there were structural problems was either blind or lying. That's when Tom mentioned something that made my stomach turn. He'd inspected 3 other homes in Pine Rest Estates over the past 6 months, all elderly residents, all facing similar emergency safety violations from Chacha Mustafa. Mrs. Agnes Kowalski, a 78-year-old retired teacher, had been forced to sell her home for $89,000 after Priscilla claimed her plumbing posed a community health hazard. Tom found nothing wrong with her pipes. "It's a pattern," Tom said, packing up his gear. "They target people who seem vulnerable, manufacture emergencies, then pressure them to sell before they can fight back." That afternoon, I began my own investigation. Politics taught me that the fastest way to uncover the truth is to listen to the people living it. So I organized something that looked harmless, a senior coffee club at the community center every Tuesday. Mrs. Kowalski showed up first, sharp-eyed, carrying homemade pierogi and stories that made my blood boil. Tom Bradley joined next, a Vietnam veteran whose only violation had been painting his garage door the wrong shade of approved gray. By the third meeting, 8 seniors were sharing coffee and horror stories about Chacha Mustafa abuse. "She's systematic," Mrs. Kowalski said calmly, pouring coffee. "She targets vulnerable residents, invents violations, accelerates deadlines, and claims emergency authority that doesn't exist. When people can't pay fast enough, she connects them with developers offering quick cash sales." Here's what I learned about emergency demolition law. Property cannot be condemned without certified proof of immediate danger and at least 72 hours notice. The takeaway? Always demand independent verification of any emergency involving your property. But Priscilla wasn't done escalating. A week later, she sent a notice that made everything personal. Due to the imminent nature of structural failure risk, Chacha Mustafa was invoking emergency demolition authority. My property was scheduled for immediate safety demolition. 21 days. That's all the notice she gave before scheduling the destruction of Sarah's dream home. That evening, sitting on my porch listening to mockingbirds and distant traffic, I made a decision that would change everything. I pulled out my secure phone, the one used for state business, and called the Attorney General's office. I didn't identify myself as governor, not yet, but I gave enough information to trigger an elder fraud investigation. What Priscilla didn't know was that the confused old retiree had just activated the state's elder fraud task force. The hunter was about to become the hunted.
"Trust me," she said, laughing softly. "He's perfect for this. No family connections, no political influence, just another lonely widower who won't know how to fight back. His wife died of cancer, so he's probably still too grief-stricken to think straight." I froze on the stepladder. Sarah's wind chime went still in my hands. "We can bulldoze his place and have it sold to Mountain Vista Development by Christmas," Priscilla continued. "Greg's already lined up the buyers, some tech executive from California who wants a mountain retreat. Clean $2.1 million flip." The pieces clicked into place like tumblers in a lock. Priscilla hadn't targeted me by accident. I was chosen because she thought I was weak, a recent widower with no political influence, no family backup, no strength left to fight her manufactured violations. If only she knew. I climbed down from the ladder and walked through the house, past Sarah's reading chair, past the framed photos of our life together, straight to the secure safe hidden behind the bookcase. Inside was my governor's credential wallet. I pulled it out and stared at the gold badge that represented 20 years of public service. Priscilla Whitmore had targeted the one person in her entire community who could dissolve Chacha Mustafa with a single executive order. She'd chosen to victimize the one resident who could activate state police task forces, trigger federal investigations, and coordinate directly with the Attorney General. But as I stood there holding that badge, something stopped me. Revealing my identity now would only save my house. It wouldn't restore Mrs. Kowalski's home. It wouldn't recover Tom Bradley's savings. It wouldn't help the 38 families already defrauded. If I wanted real justice, the kind that ensured Priscilla could never hurt another family, I needed her to destroy herself completely. I needed an airtight case, federal charges, prison time. So I stayed undercover. That afternoon, I made a series of phone calls that would have terrified Priscilla if she'd known. First, I contacted the state police white-collar crime unit and shared detailed documentation of the fraud pattern. Then I called the FBI's elder abuse task force and gave them everything I'd collected on the property seizure scheme. Finally, I made the call that sealed her fate. I contacted the Attorney General directly and explained that I had evidence of organized fraud, RICO-level violations, that could put Priscilla away for 20 years. Here's what I learned about federal fraud law. When someone uses fabricated violations to systematically steal property from multiple victims, it qualifies as organized crime under the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. The takeaway: manufactured property theft isn't a civil dispute, it's federal racketeering. When I hung up, I smiled for the first time in weeks. Priscilla had made the classic mistake of every small-time crook who gets greedy. She believed she was untouchable. 38 victims without consequences had convinced her she was invincible. She had no idea her 39th victim had spent 2 decades dismantling corrupt officials. That evening, I sat on the porch with Sarah's journal open, listening to her wind chimes sing in the mountain breeze. An owl called from the pines, and the scent of autumn filled the air. "Okay, sweetheart," I whispered to the butterflies still drifting through her garden. "Time to protect our sanctuary." The hunter was about to learn she'd been stalking a grizzly bear. The next morning, Mark Morrison, the confused widower, disappeared. Governor Calvin Morrison took his place. First came physical preparation. I installed a comprehensive security system: cameras hidden in birdhouses, motion sensors disguised as garden lights, audio equipment capable of recording conversations from 50 yards away. Every interaction with Priscilla would now be preserved as federal-grade evidence. The smell of fresh-cut wood filled my garage as I built concealed mounts for the equipment. The scent took me back to weekends building projects with Sarah. This time, I wasn't building a deck. I was building a trap. Next came the legal strategy. I coordinated quietly with Attorney General Patricia Hayes, without revealing my identity, to construct a bulletproof RICO case. She assigned Detective Maria Santos, the state's leading elder fraud expert. "Whoever's feeding us this," Santos told Hayes during a call I monitored, "understands law enforcement better than most officers. The evidence is flawless." If only they knew. My senior coffee club became the perfect cover. Every Tuesday, 8 elderly residents gathered, sharing stories while I documented everything. To outsiders, we looked like lonely retirees. In reality, we were assembling a federal indictment. Mrs. Kowalski proved invaluable. Her meticulous bookkeeping preserved every document from her own ordeal. Tom Bradley brought military precision, tracking Priscilla's meetings and photographing her connections to Mountain Vista development. The numbers were staggering: 38 properties, over $8 million seized. Priscilla's personal cut exceeded $2 million. Here's what I learned about evidence preservation: photograph everything, timestamp everything, use certified mail, preserve witness statements, and secure independent inspections. The takeaway: overwhelm criminals with proof they can't erase. Meanwhile, agencies aligned quietly. The FBI prepared federal charges. The Attorney General built RICO violations. State police documented elder abuse. Anonymous tips from the governor's office lead the groundwork for legislation to stop future Chacha Mustafa abuse. Timing was everything. Priscilla scheduled my demolition on Friday at 9 a.m. I scheduled my reveal on Thursday at 8 a.m. during the emergency Chacha Mustafa meeting she called to celebrate my resolution. She thought she was hosting a victory party. She had no idea she was walking into her own arrest. But the most important preparation was emotional. Every evening, I sat on my porch with Sarah's journal, writing letters to the wife I'd lost and the community I was about to save. Her wind chimes played their gentle songs while monarch butterflies prepared for their migration south, just as they had during her final autumn with me.
"I know you'd tell me to do the right thing," I wrote in the journal margins, my pen scratching against the pages as the mountain wind rustled them, "even if it means risking everything we built here." The sound of distant highway traffic mingled with the evening birds as I planned the final details of Priscilla's downfall. She had built her career predicting how vulnerable people would react under pressure. Her scam depended on victims being isolated, grief-stricken, and overwhelmed. She had made a critical miscalculation, assuming a recently widowed man is weak. She was about to learn that losing the person you love most doesn't make you vulnerable, it makes you dangerous. 1 week before my scheduled demolition, Priscilla made her most desperate move. I was in Sarah's butterfly garden at dawn, deadheading autumn flowers to help them survive the frost, when I heard the rumble of heavy equipment on my driveway. The morning air carried the sharp smell of diesel exhaust and disturbed earth as a landscaping crew began emergency repairs around my foundation. They weren't repairing anything. They were manufacturing damage for her fake engineering reports. I watched from the kitchen window as 3 men with sledgehammers and crowbars systematically smashed the stonework around my foundation. One took before and after photos, another carefully created cracks to fool untrained eyes. Everything was captured by the hidden cameras I'd installed the week before. "Mr. Morrison?" Priscilla called when she spotted me watching. She wore another designer outfit, clipboard held like a shield. "We're conducting emergency foundation stabilization to prevent immediate collapse." Emergency foundation stabilization with sledgehammers. "I didn't authorize this work," I said, stepping onto the porch where hidden microphones captured our conversation. "Unfortunately, emergency safety protocols don't require individual authorization," she replied theatrically. "When structural failure poses an imminent risk to neighboring properties, Chacha Mustafa has the authority to take protective action." She was manufacturing evidence in broad daylight, confident a confused widower couldn't challenge her fake authority. That afternoon, I received confirmation of just how deep her corruption went. Randy Walsh, the building inspector who had certified her previous fake violation reports, had been caught accepting $5,000 to sign off on my catastrophic structural failure assessment. Detective Santos, still unaware she was speaking to the governor, filled me in. "We've got Walsh on tape taking the bribe. He's cooperating for reduced charges. He's been rubber stamping Priscilla's fake reports for over a year." The corruption was systematic. Priscilla had bought herself a building inspector, several fake engineers, and enough local officials to make her property theft scheme appear legitimate. She'd built an entire network of fraud designed to prey on vulnerable seniors. But in her desperation, she made a crucial error. She started pressuring other residents to support her emergency demolition order by claiming I was mentally unstable due to grief. "Poor Mr. Morrison has been struggling since his wife passed," she told Mrs. Henderson at the community mailboxes, unaware Mrs. Henderson was part of our Tuesday coffee group. "He's become confrontational and paranoid. Honestly, I'm worried about his mental state." Mrs. Henderson, sharp as ever, played along perfectly. "Oh my, that does sound concerning. What kind of confrontational behavior?" "He's been asking inappropriate questions about Chacha Mustafa procedures," Priscilla whispered, lowering her voice conspiratorially, "demanding covenant amendments, questioning emergency authority, threatening to contact state officials. Clearly grief-related delusion, but it's complicating our safety work." Threatening to contact state officials, if only she knew. That afternoon, I sat in my study reviewing the case file I'd built. Federal wire fraud charges, state elder abuse violations, racketeering conspiracy, bribery, and systematic theft of private property. When the arrests came, Priscilla would face 20 to 30 years in federal prison. As I reviewed the evidence, I realized something satisfying. Priscilla's greatest strength, her ability to intimidate vulnerable people, was about to become her greatest weakness. She had perfected methods to break down isolated seniors who felt powerless, but she'd never encountered someone who understood her game better than she did. Tomorrow was Thursday. Priscilla Whitmore would hold her final Chacha Mustafa meeting, expecting to celebrate demolishing another elderly resident's home. Instead, she'd discovered that the confused widower was the most powerful elected official in the state, and her criminal enterprise had been under federal investigation for weeks. Sarah's wind chimes drifted through the study window as I closed the case file, preparing for the most satisfying moment of my career. Thursday morning arrived crisp and clear. I stood on the porch at sunrise, sipping coffee from Sarah's favorite mug, watching her butterflies gather nectar for their final journey south. Today was the day Priscilla Whitmore's world would collapse. She'd called an emergency Chacha Mustafa meeting for 8 a.m. to discuss final safety protocols for my demolition scheduled the next morning. In her mind, it was a victory lap, a display of authority. She had no idea federal agents were already in position around the community center. At 7:30, I put on my best suit instead of flannel. I slipped my governor's credentials into my jacket pocket next to Sarah's reading glasses, which I'd carried every day since her passing. Detective Santos coordinated with the FBI to ensure everything would be recorded, and Channel 7 News would capture Priscilla's public downfall. The community center was packed. 38 former victims sat in the front rows, including Mrs. Kowalski and Tom Bradley. Current residents filled the middle seats, many genuinely concerned about community safety from Priscilla's manufactured crisis. News cameras lined the back, ostensibly covering the emergency safety demolition. Priscilla stood at the podium in her most expensive blazer, clipboard thick with fake documentation. She looked confident, victorious, completely unaware she was about to become the subject of the state's largest elder fraud arrest. "Thank you all for coming to this emergency meeting," she began, her voice filled with her familiar fake concern. "Today, we're addressing the final safety protocols for the Morrison residence demolition scheduled tomorrow morning." She gestured toward me, sitting quietly in the third row. "Mr. Morrison, I want to thank you for your cooperation during this difficult process. I know losing your wife was traumatic, and grief can make it hard to accept necessary safety measures." Several residents nodded sympathetically, believing she was helping a confused widower navigate a dangerous property situation. "Our comprehensive structural analysis has confirmed that the Morrison residence poses an immediate threat to surrounding homes," Priscilla continued, reading from her fake engineering report.
Tomorrow's 8 a.m. emergency demolition will eliminate this safety risk and allow us to move forward with appropriate community development, Priscilla announced. Community development. She couldn't resist hinting at the luxury resort she planned to build on the ruins of my home. Before we proceeded with the final vote to authorize demolition, she added, "I'd like to give Mr. Morrison one last opportunity to address the community." This was it. She was giving me a chance to plead for mercy, to embarrass myself in front of cameras, to provide her with dramatic footage of a broken old man accepting defeat. I stood slowly, playing the part of the exhausted widower one final time. Several residents looked at me with pity, expecting to witness the sad surrender of someone overwhelmed by bureaucratic complexity. "Thank you, Miss Whitmore," I said, my voice steady but calm. "I do have a few things I'd like to share with the community." I walked to the podium, passing Detective Santos near the emergency exit. FBI agents were stationed throughout, ready to move the moment I gave the signal. "First," I said, looking directly at Priscilla, "I want everyone to understand that my wife Sarah didn't die because she was weak. She died fighting cancer with every ounce of strength she had, and she taught me that when bullies try to destroy what you love, you don't roll over and let them win."
Murmurs rippled through the audience. This wasn't the broken surrender speech Priscilla had expected. Second, I continued, pulling out my phone to display the comprehensive evidence file I'd assembled, I've spent the past 2 months documenting systematic fraud, elder abuse, and racketeering conspiracy involving Chacha Mustafa and its development partners. Priscilla's confident smile began to fade. Third, I said, reaching into my jacket pocket, before we discuss demolishing my home tomorrow, I thought you might want to know exactly whose property you've been trying to steal. I held up my governor's credentials for all to see. The room went silent except for camera shutters clicking. My name is Governor Calvin Morrison, I announced, my voice carrying the authority I'd hidden for months. And Priscilla Whitmore, you are under arrest for organized fraud, elder abuse, and racketeering conspiracy against the people of this state. Detective Santos stepped forward with handcuffs as FBI agents blocked the exits. Priscilla's face went pale as she realized her supposed vulnerable target was actually her worst nightmare. You can't do this, she whispered, backing away from the podium. You're just some retired government consultant. Ma'am, I said, showing her my official identification, I've been fighting corruption longer than you've been alive, and targeting my wife's sanctuary was the biggest mistake you'll ever make. The click of the handcuffs closing was the most satisfying sound I'd heard since Sarah's final laugh. The moment Priscilla realized she'd targeted the governor was captured perfectly by 3 news cameras and preserved as evidence in a federal racketeering case. Governor Morrison? She stammered, clipboard clattering to the floor. That's impossible. You're Mark Morrison, a retired government consultant. I am Calvin Morrison, I replied, holding up my credentials for the packed community center to see. Yes, I'm a widower, but I'm also the governor, and you've just committed federal crimes against 38 of my constituents. Cameras captured every moment as FBI agents moved through the crowd, clarifying their presence to residents who had assumed they were just community safety officials. Detective Santos read Priscilla's her rights as she stared, realizing that her supposed vulnerable target was actually her worst nightmare. You can't do this, she whispered, backing away from the podium. You're just some retired government consultant. Ma'am, I said, showing her my official identification, I've been fighting corruption longer than you've been alive, and targeting my wife's sanctuary was the biggest mistake you'll ever make. The click of the handcuffs closing was the most satisfying sound I'd heard since Sarah's final laugh. The moment Priscilla realized she'd targeted the governor was captured perfectly by 3 news cameras and preserved as evidence in a federal racketeering case. Governor Morrison? She stammered, clipboard clattering to the floor. That's impossible. You're Mark Morrison, a retired government consultant. I am Calvin Morrison, I replied, holding up my credentials for the packed community center to see. Yes, I'm a widower, but I'm also the governor, and you've just committed federal crimes against 38 of my constituents. Cameras captured every moment as FBI agents moved through the crowd, clarifying their presence to residents who had assumed they were just community safety officials. Detective Santos read Priscilla's her rights as she stared, realizing that her supposed vulnerable target was actually her worst nightmare. You can't do this, she whispered, backing away from the podium. You're just some retired government consultant. Ma'am, I said, showing her my official identification, I've been fighting corruption longer than you've been alive, and targeting my wife's sanctuary was the biggest mistake you'll ever make. The click of the handcuffs closing was the most satisfying sound I'd heard since Sarah's final laugh. The moment Priscilla realized she'd targeted the governor was captured perfectly by 3 news cameras and preserved as evidence in a federal racketeering case.
As they led her away, Priscilla made one final desperate plea. Governor Morrison, please, I didn't know who you were. If I had known, I never would have... I interrupted her with the line that would be quoted in news reports for weeks. Miss Whitmore, the problem isn't that you didn't know who I was. The problem is that you thought it mattered. Every one of these families deserved the same protection you would have given me if you'd known my title. That morning, the FBI arrested 4 additional conspirators. Randy Walsh, the building inspector who had accepted bribes to sign fake reports, 2 development company executives who had knowingly purchased stolen properties, and Priscilla's assistant who had forged Chacha Mustafa documents. But the most satisfying moment came when Agent Walsh announced the financial recovery. All seized assets, Chacha Mustafa accounts, Priscilla's personal holdings, and the development company profits would be placed in a victim restitution fund totaling $11.3 million. Every family affected by this fraud would receive full compensation plus damages. Mrs. Kowalski burst into tears. Tom Bradley saluted. 38 families who had thought they'd lost everything suddenly discovered that justice was possible. As the cameras captured Priscilla being led away in handcuffs, she made one final mistake. She looked back at me with pure hatred and hissed, "Your wife would be ashamed of what you've become." The room went dead silent. Even the reporters stopped taking notes. I walked over to her, voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the community center. My wife Sarah planted a butterfly garden to bring beauty into the world. I said, "You tried to destroy it for profit." She spent her final months creating something that would help others find peace. You spent 2 years creating misery to steal people's homes. If Sarah were here, she'd be proud that I protected her sanctuary and brought justice to the families you victimized. The handcuffs clicked one final time as they led Priscilla Whitmore out into a federal courthouse that would become her home for the next 25 years. Standing there, surrounded by the families whose lives had been restored by evidence and justice, I felt Sarah's presence as clearly as if she were beside me. The mountain wind moved through the pine trees just like it moved through her wind chimes every evening on our porch. We had protected our sanctuary, and we had ensured no other family would suffer what these good people had endured. 6 months later, I sat on my porch watching Sarah's butterflies return for spring when Detective Santos called with the final update. "Governor," she said, satisfaction in her voice, "the federal sentencing came down this morning. 2 years in federal prison on 23 counts of racketeering, elder fraud, and conspiracy. No possibility of parole for the first 15 years. Priscilla will be 67 when she gets out, the same age as many of the seniors she targeted." "What about the development company executives?" I asked, watching a monarch butterfly land on one of Sarah's black-eyed Susans. "Greg Patterson got 12 years for conspiracy and money laundering. His partner, Michael Torres, got 10. Building Inspector Walsh received 5 years for accepting bribes. The whole network is finished." The financial recovery exceeded our expectations. Federal asset forfeiture seized Priscilla's mansion, her Tesla with that ridiculous personalized plate, and the development company's profits from 24 fraudulent property flips. Combined with insurance settlements and penalty damages, the Victim Restitution Fund reached $14.7 million. Mrs. Kowalski bought back her original home and established a college scholarship fund for students studying elder law. Tom Bradley used his settlement to start a veterans advocacy organization, helping elderly military families avoid predatory practices. All 38 families received full compensation plus emotional damages. Chacha Mustafa was permanently dissolved by executive order, replaced by a voluntary neighborhood association with transparent oversight. I had signed legislation requiring independent audits for all community associations, creating whistleblower protections for residents, and establishing mandatory penalties for officials who abused their authority. The Elder Protection in Community Governance Act became a model for 12 other states, and Congress worked on federal protections preventing future predators like Priscilla Whitmore. Most satisfying of all, Sarah's butterfly garden became a protected conservation area that no future development could touch. Her wildflower meadow would welcome monarchs and painted ladies for generations to come. The wind chimes she chose still played their gentle evening songs beside a small granite plaque, "Sarah Morrison Memorial Butterfly Garden," in memory of a woman who brought beauty into the world and taught that protecting what we love requires courage. Our daughter Emma returned from deployment and expanded the butterfly habitat with native plants.
Every Tuesday, our senior coffee club still met, but now we shared updates about grandchildren and plans for the annual Sarah Morrison Memorial Butterfly Festival. The prosecution inspired nationwide investigations. The Department of Justice created a national elder fraud task force, using our evidence-gathering methods to break up property theft schemes in 12 states, protecting tens of thousands of seniors. As the sun set behind the mountains, I opened Sarah's journal and wrote my final entry. Today marks 6 months since justice was served. The butterflies are coming home. The garden is blooming. 38 families have their lives back. You always said protecting what we love requires courage. We chose justice, and it made all the difference. The scent of night-blooming jasmine drifted across the porch, mixing with pine and wildflower fragrance. In a few weeks, the monarchs would begin their journey south, carrying the memory of Sarah's garden. Priscilla thought power meant preying on the vulnerable. She learned that real power comes from protecting those who cannot protect themselves. Sarah's butterflies were safe. 38 families had their dignity restored. And somewhere in federal prison, a predator was learning that there are consequences for targeting people who make our communities worth defending. That is what makes every battle worthwhile, knowing that love protected by courage and guided by justice always finds a way to bloom.